Tonight, as the world outside your window grows quiet, come a little closer to the warmth of this story. Let the soft rhythm of the night guide your breath and allow me to lead you gently into a century-long past. England, in the middle of the 15th century, slumbered beneath a sky of drifting clouds and dim lanterns. Villages murmured with simple life, knights polished armor that had not tasted battle in years, and the kingdom looked peaceful, almost deceptively so. For beneath that calm horizon, cracks had begun to spread like thin lines on old glass, and no one yet understood how deeply they would break the realm. If you listened closely to the land in those days, you might have heard something faint, a sigh from the old stones of castle walls, a whisper from forgotten halls where kings once prayed for strength. England was tired. Tired from foreign wars, tired from weak leadership, tired from a crown that trembled on the brow of Henry VI. But ordinary folk, from shepherds to merchants, still hoped the kingdom would rise strong again. They didn't know that fate had already dipped its quill into a darker ink, preparing to write a tale where loyalty would twist, brothers would bleed, and noble houses would turn their hearts into battlegrounds. And in the midst of this slow unraveling, two symbols began to shine like omens in the dusk, a red rose and a white. At first they were harmless, simple emblems embroidered on cloaks, carved onto rings, pinned onto banners fluttering lazily in the wind. Yet every emblem carries a story, and these two carried storms. The red rose belonged to the House of Lancaster, protectors of the reigning king. The white rose belonged to the House of York, bold claimants with pride sharp as their swords. Two flowers, one born of passion, the other of icy resolve, waiting for the right season to bloom or to bleed. Imagine for a moment walking through London's narrow streets during those early days. A baker hums by his oven, oblivious to the nobles plotting inside their manors. A pair of scholars whisper in taverns about the king's fragile mind. And drifting above it all, unseen yet steadily growing, is that quiet tension, like a string pulled too tight. It was the kind of unease you feel before a storm breaks, even when the sky still looks gentle. And perhaps, if someone had simply urged the nobles to share a cup of wine and behave like decent adults, the tragedy might have softened. But nobles rarely take advice, especially the sensible kind. So tonight, let this be your first step into a land where roses were not just flowers, but warnings. Where colors became declarations, and declarations became destinies. Before the blades sang and the crowns changed hands, there was only this moment. England breathing in the dark, unaware that its next exhale would shake the kingdom for generations. And as you rest your head, keep close the thought that history never truly sleeps. It lingers beside us like a quiet companion waiting to be remembered. Thank you for listening to Let Me Tell You. When you're ready, we'll wander deeper into the shadows together. Let your breath fall steady for a moment, as though the night itself were humming softly beside you. Now follow me deeper into the heart of England, to a time when the kingdom felt as if a great weight pressed upon its chest. Henry VI sat on the throne, gentle, devout, and warm of heart, but a king's crown is a heavy thing for a man whose spirit drifts like a candle flame in a drafty hall. Under his rule, decisions came late, advisors argued endlessly, and the nation waited and waited until waiting became its only certainty. The land needed a shepherd, yet its shepherd often wandered into the fog of his own mind. In the courts of Westminster, you could sense the fragility long before the people did. Nobles gathered around the king like restless birds circling a sleeping lion, each whispering a different remedy for England's troubles. Strength, said one, tradition, said another, and a few, lowering their voices even further, murmured, a new king, perhaps. But no one dared finish the thought aloud. Meanwhile, across the countryside, the fabric of daily life began to fray. Trade slowed, harvests were uncertain, and taxes piled upon shoulders already bowed from years of foreign war. The kingdom wasn't dying, no, but it had certainly begun to wheeze. And as the economy trembled, suspicion rose like mist from the River Thames. Lords eyed one another, not as allies, but as rivals, predators watching predators. Each believed he carried the true solution for England's future, which is always a dangerous belief for a nobleman to have. The great families maneuvered quietly at first, gathering allies, forging fragile pacts, and sharpening the edges of their ambitions behind polite smiles. Even the common folk could sense something wrong. They felt it in the silence between church bells, in the uneasy glances exchanged at markets, in the way news traveled with more fear than urgency. Something unseen, something darkening. Henry VI, poor soul, seemed unaware that the throne beneath him had begun to tilt. At times he drifted into long spells of melancholy so deep that the court moved around him like servants tending to a ghost. And in those absences, those soft, haunting lapses, others stepped forward. Queen Margaret tried fiercely to guard his power, yet her strength only fueled the resentment of those who believed she held too much influence. Advisors quarreled like children fighting over crumbs. And through this bickering, one realization crept in. England had no captain at the helm. The ship was sailing, yes, but toward a storm no one dared name. So the kingdom breathed thinner and thinner, until even the night air seemed heavy with a fate not yet spoken. The red rose of Lancaster still clung to the throne, but the white rose of York had begun to bloom in the shadows, quietly, patiently, like a rival heartbeat. These were the years when trouble gathered its weapons, when silence rehearsed its scream. And as you settle into your pillow, remember, nations rarely fall in a single moment. They crumble softly first, like old parchment touched by time. Settle your thoughts, as though night were smoothing its hand across your brow. Now let us step into the winding corridors of lineage, those ancient threads that tied England's fate to two proud houses. On one side stood Lancaster, bearers of the Red Rose, descended from John of Gaunt, son of the mighty Edward III. Their bloodline carried the authority of kingship, or at least the memory of it. On the other side rose the House of York, heirs of Edmund of Langley, another branch from the same royal tree. Two families born from the same ancient crown, yet somehow determined to prove that kinship was no barrier to conflict. In their shared ancestry lay the seed of every storm that would soon follow. Lancaster, with its red rose, claimed the throne through Henry VI, soft-spoken, mild, and ruled more by prayer than policy. Behind him stood supporters who clung to tradition and royal continuity. York, however, cherished a fiercer logic. If a king is weak, the kingdom suffers. And if the kingdom suffers, then someone more capable must take the helm. Their white rose was a symbol not of coldness, but of clarity, an insistence that lineage alone was not enough without strength. And so the two houses began circling one another like shadows cast by the same candle flame, each believing the crown would shine brightest on their own brow. Yet beneath their banners and polished coats of arms lay old wounds, bruises that time never fully healed. Lancaster had long held the throne, but critics whispered that their rule drifted like a wheel stuck in soft earth. York felt overlooked, undervalued, denied the position they believed destiny had intended for them. Every banquet, every council meeting, every polite bow carried weight. It was almost amusing in a tragic way how men draped in silk and velvet could hold grudges sharper than any sword. One might think that with all their estates, jewels, and titles, peace would come naturally. But nobles often have a talent for turning comfort into conflict. Perhaps they simply found tranquility too boring. Still, if you walked into the halls of either house in those days, you would feel the same mixture of pride and unease. Portraits of kings long departed stared down from stone walls, as if judging the living for their ambitions. Servants moved quietly, always listening, always aware that a misplaced word could ripple into scandal. And through it all, Lancaster and York fashioned their plans like master weavers, thread by thread, ally by ally, whisper by whisper. Neither wished for war, not truly, but power has a peculiar way of nudging gentle intentions towards sharper paths. Before long, every symbol, every gesture, even the color of a lord's cloak could betray allegiance. Thus the realm stood between two roses, red and white, each blooming with pride, each casting a shadow long enough to stretch across the kingdom. And as the tension deepened, England found itself caught between these rival hearts, uncertain which one beat truer. Tonight, as the quiet settles around you, hold this thought. Sometimes the greatest tragedies begin not with swords drawn, but with families forgetting they were once the same tree. Let the night draw a little closer as we step into the moment when England finally admitted the truth her heart had been whispering for years. The realm could no longer hide behind polite smiles or courtly dances. Choices had to be made. And choices in those days were not spoken in words, but worn in colors. A red rose for Lancaster, a white rose for York. Simple emblems that soon became declarations of the soul. From the highest baron in his stone manor to the baker dusted in flour before dawn, everyone found themselves pulled toward one banner or the other, as though fate itself had tugged at their sleeves and murmured, "Choose, for the storm has begun." Town squares that once echoed with market chatter now watched men gather in uneasy circles, debating loyalty with hushed voices. A butcher might pin a red rose to his tunic because his lord preferred Lancaster, while the stonemason across the street wore white because York's promises sounded steadier than the trembling court in Westminster. Children, unaware of the weight such symbols carried, sometimes plucked roses from gardens and waved them in play, never knowing that soon real roses would be trampled beneath soldiers' boots. And those who wished to stay neutral found that neutrality is a fragile shield. Sooner or later, someone would ask, "Which side holds your heart?" Then came the day when whispers hardened into marching boots. The First Battle of St. Albans. It began like a dooming drumbeat in the distance, stirring the air with a tension that even the birds seemed to sense. The narrow streets of the town, usually filled with merchants calling out prices, suddenly became corridors of fear. Yorkist and Lancastrian forces collided in a burst of steel and shouts, and England realized, with a terrible stillness, that her soil would drink the blood of her own sons. It wasn't a grand, orchestrated war yet, just a sharp, startling crack in the kingdom's foundation. But like any crack, it promised to widen. Stories spread quickly, carried by trembling lips and wide, sleepless eyes. Some said they saw noblemen fighting like desperate animals, as though honor itself had slipped through their fingers. Others whispered that the roses seemed to glow brighter on the battlefield, as if mocking the men who fought beneath them. A few old widows muttered that England had finally angered God. Honestly, with the way the nobles behaved, it was impressive he hadn't sent a thunderbolt sooner. And yet, behind the fear and the grim news, people felt something else rising. the certainty that this would not be the last clash. War had stretched its limbs, and it wanted more. When the dust settled and the cries faded into memory, England found herself changed. No matter how hard the kingdom tried to return to its routines, the air carried a different weight, like a room that still smells of smoke long after the flame has died. The red and white roses no longer felt like harmless symbols, but living forces shaping every household, every journey, every dream. So as the night wraps gently around you, remember how quietly a nation can slip into chaos, how softly a single battle can shift the destiny of millions. Let your breath settle softly, as though the night itself were listening beside you. Now we turn our steps toward a man whose presence began as a quiet ripple, but soon swelled into a tide strong enough to shake the kingdom. Richard, Duke of York, sharp-minded, steady-voiced, and carved from the stern timber of royal blood, watched England falter under the fragile reign of Henry VI. He said little at first, observing the chaos with the calm patience of someone who measured storms, not feared them. Yet behind those thoughtful eyes, something long dormant stirred. A question, a possibility, a crown that seemed to draw nearer each time Henry stumbled. Richard's lineage alone gave weight to his growing ambition. He descended from 2 lines of Edward III's sons, an inheritance that made many whisper that his claim to the throne stood even firmer than the king's. But ambition, like fire, needs tinder. That tinder came in the form of allies, powerful lords who found in Richard the strength and clarity Henry lacked. The Earl of Warwick, bold as a falcon; Salisbury, steady and calculating; countless knights and retainers who felt the realm slipping through the fingers of a king who could barely grasp his own thoughts. Together they formed a circle of influence that hummed with quiet purpose. Still, Richard was no reckless dreamer. He played his hand with a subtlety that would make even a fox blush. He accepted positions of authority, governed regions, restored order where Henry's advisors had failed. And with each success, the nobles took notice. Here, they whispered behind heavy oak doors, is a man who might actually rescue England. Richard himself did not yet speak of the crown aloud. That would have been folly. But in private moments, perhaps when walking alone through the chilly corridors of his estates, one imagines he felt the faint brush of destiny on his shoulders, the kind of whisper that says, "Why not you?" Yet ambition never rises without stirring conflict. Queen Margaret, fierce in her loyalty to her husband's throne, saw Richard's growing influence as a creeping shadow. Some in her circle claimed he sought only to guide the king. Others hissed that he meant to replace him outright. The court divided sharply, Lancaster clinging to tradition and bloodline, York gathering those weary of waiting for a king who seldom spoke. Every banquet, every council meeting, every glance exchanged across the hall brimmed with tension. It was almost comical to watch nobles pretending civility while plotting with enough enthusiasm to fuel an entire troupe of actors. Peace had become nothing more than a polite costume they wore to hide their unrest. And so Richard of York stepped gradually into the light, calm, capable, and increasingly certain that England needed more than gentle hopes and trembling prayers. The crown, though still far from his brow, no longer felt like an impossible dream. It hovered in the distance, glinting just enough to tempt a man who believed he could steer the kingdom back into order. As the night folds quietly around you, remember how softly ambition can begin, just a single spark glowing in the dark before it grows bold enough to challenge a king. Rest your thoughts a moment, as though the night were drawing a soft curtain over the noise of the world. Now let us return to the dimly lit corridors of England's troubled court. where a gentle king sat upon a throne far too heavy for his shoulders. Henry VI, sweet of nature and soft of voice, carried a heart more suited for cloisters than for battlefields. He dreamed of peace the way others dream of triumph, and he wished nothing more than a quiet kingdom where prayers rose higher than swords. Yet a crown is a demanding companion, and it does not bend to the wishes of a tender soul. It presses, it weighs, it expects. The courtiers who surrounded Henry knew this truth all too well. They watched him drift into long silences, his eyes distant, his hands trembling ever so slightly, as if holding back memories too difficult to face. At times he would wander the palace corridors like a lost child seeking a familiar door. He was kind, achingly kind, but kindness alone could not steer a kingdom battered by ambition. Rumors of his fragility leaked outward like water through cracked stone, and England, ever hungry for direction, began to look elsewhere. A kingdom may tolerate a gentle king, but it cannot survive a broken one. It was during this slow unraveling that the crown began to tilt, almost imperceptibly at first. Decisions delayed turned into opportunities lost turned into chaos. Queen Margaret, fierce as a lioness defending her den, tried to hold the realm together with sheer will. Her determination was admirable, though her fire frightened some and provoked others. Many nobles whispered that she wielded more authority than the king himself, a scandalous thought in a land where tradition clung tighter than ivy on castle walls. Yet even her strength could not hide the truth. Henry's reign was dripping through the cracks like sand in an hourglass. Foreign envoys spoke of England with puzzled sympathy. How could the realm that once thundered across France now be led by a king who sometimes did not recognize his own advisors? Even the common folk began to murmur in taverns and market stalls. A gentle heart is a blessing, one brewer sighed, but a crown needs more than blessings. And perhaps that was the cruelest lesson of all. For Henry, with his pure intentions and unwavering faith, wanted nothing but harmony. Yet his softness created a vacuum. And in politics, a vacuum is an invitation. The white rose of York grew bolder, its ambitions no longer whispered, but quietly prepared. And so, almost without realizing it, England watched her king slip further into the shadows of his own mind. The crown still rested on his head, yes, but only in appearance. Its authority had begun its slow, inevitable journey into other hands. A kingdom cannot wait forever, and fate was already drawing up its ledger, ready to decide who would next claim the throne. As you breathe into the stillness of this night, hold close the sorrow of a good man overwhelmed by a merciless world. Let the darkness gather gently around you, the way velvet folds itself over an old wooden chest. For now we step toward a presence so fierce, so unyielding, that even seasoned lords straightened their backs when she entered a room. Margaret of Anjou, queen, wife, mother, and storm, was not born of England, yet she carried its crown with a fire that startled the court. Where Henry VI drifted like a feather caught in a wandering breeze, Margaret stood rooted, sharp as winter wind, unafraid to challenge any man who doubted her resolve. She arrived young, graceful, and bright-eyed, but beneath that grace slept a lioness waiting her moment to wake. And awaken she did, for the kingdom offered her no gentle welcome. It was a land unraveling, ruled by a husband whose mind often slipped into silence. Margaret quickly realized that if she did not seize the reins of power, Lancaster would crumble beneath the weight of indecision. So she learned the art of English politics with the speed of someone studying for her life. She forged alliances, dismissed those who undermined the crown, and stepped into council chambers dominated by men who believed a queen should smile, not speak. They expected a docile ornament. Instead, they received a commander who held her own will like a drawn blade. Many nobles resented her authority, of course. They found it troubling when a woman dared to stand taller than their pride. Some whispered that she meddled too much, others that she ruled instead of Henry. But Margaret did not bow to gossip carried by tongues that had nothing better to do. She knew the truth. The Red Rose of Lancaster needed a guardian bold enough to defend it against the rising ambitions of York. If the king could not act, then she must. And so she became the heart of the Lancastrian cause, its strategist, its voice, its unshakable spine. Even her enemies admitted, though grudgingly, that she possessed more courage than half the knights sworn to defend her. Her fire burned brightest when danger pressed hard against the throne. She rallied armies, negotiated alliances with northern lords, and reminded those who hesitated that loyalty was not a choice to be made on pleasant afternoons, but a vow tested in storms. There were moments when she faced the battlefield herself, armored not in steel, but in unbroken will. The sight of her riding through the camp, chin high, eyes fierce, stirred soldiers' hearts more effectively than any rousing sermon could. And perhaps, deep inside, she resented the fate that made her fight battles meant for a king. But Margaret had no time for bitterness. History does not pause for wounded pride. So the lioness stood guard over the fading strength of Lancaster, her roar echoing through council halls and camps alike. She fought because she loved her husband, her son, her dynasty, and because surrender was a foreign language her spirit refused to learn. As you rest beneath the hush of the night, remember this: in an age ruled by crowns and blades, sometimes the fiercest warrior was the one who carried neither. Close your eyes for a moment and let the world fall quiet. So quiet you could hear the breath of winter itself. Towton lay beneath a sky the color of pewter, a sky that seemed unsure whether to weep or to watch. Snow drifted lazily across the fields, soft as feathers shaken from an old pillow. And yet, beneath that gentle white, tens of thousands gathered with hearts beating loud enough to tremble the air. It was Palm Sunday, though the land felt far from holy. England stood divided, and Towton would become the stage where destiny wrote its harshest stanza. The battle began not with a roar, but with the wind, cold, mischievous, and very much in the mood for choosing sides. It carried Yorkist arrows farther than nature usually allowed, guiding them through the swirling snow toward the Lancastrian line. Men squinted through the blizzard, shadows moving like ghosts on the edge of sight. Nothing was clear. Everything was motion, mist, breath, and distant shouts that seemed to bounce between earth and sky. The snow fell thicker, as though the heavens tried to smother the noise, to hush the chaos before it could fully bloom. And yet, even in confusion, there was a strange, somber beauty. Imagine it: white flakes landing softly on wool hoods, the ground beneath turning muddy and uncertain, the air shimmering between snow and fog. Blades met shields with dull thuds swallowed by the storm. Colors blurred, red, white, gray, until the only thing that truly stood out was the determination etched on every face. They fought not as faceless masses, but as men carrying the weight of homes, families, and causes whispered to them since childhood. Towton was many things, but above all, it was personal. As the hours crawled onward, the snowfall grew heavier still, thick enough to soften outlines and hide distances. Some swore the sky had forgotten it was meant to be day. Others felt time stretch thin, like a candle flickering at the end of its wick. And somewhere in that frozen haze, the tide began to shift. The Yorkist line pressed forward with a relentless patience, inch by inch, breath by breath, as though the very winter pushed them from behind. The Lancastrians, their retreat slowed by the storm's deepening blanket, wavered beneath a fate that even the snow could not conceal. By twilight, the field lay quiet at last, quiet in the way only winter can command. The snow, still falling, covered everything in a pale, forgiving sheet, as if trying to erase what had been written that day. Towton would be remembered as the largest and most sorrowful clash of the age. Yet in this retelling, let it be a reminder, not of terror, but of how frail humans stand before the sweep of history. And so, beneath this soft curtain of white and the faint, lingering blush of dusk, the War of the Roses bent toward a new destiny. Let the night settle around you, and picture a young man standing against the fading glow of a winter sun, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the kind of confidence that could make even the wind pause in admiration. This was Edward, Earl of March, soon to be Edward IV. They called him the Handsome Hawk, and indeed he moved with the grace of a predator who knew exactly where he belonged, high above the chaos, scanning the world with sharp, unwavering eyes. After Towton's frozen storm, when the snow finally loosened its grip on England, Edward rose from the mist not just as a victor, but as a force of nature carving a new path for the realm. Youth burned in him, bright and impatient, like a torch lifted too close to old parchment. The kingdom, weary from years of uncertainty under Henry VI, looked upon Edward with a strange mix of relief and awe. Here was a king who actually looked like a king, tall as an oak, charming as spring after a harsh frost, and brave enough to ride into battle as casually as some nobles rode to Sunday feasts. Court chroniclers practically tripped over their own quills trying to describe him. Some praised his valor, others his fairness, and a few, blushing behind their inkpots, focused a bit too long on his remarkable ability to make armor look fashionable. Yet beneath that golden surface lay ambition as sharp as any blade. Edward did not simply want the crown, he intended to keep it, to reshape England into a realm worthy of his vision. Around him, the court became a ballroom of schemes and flirtations. Nobles whispered in shadowed corridors, their silk sleeves brushing like restless wings. Foreign envoys weighed alliances, trying to glimpse the thoughts behind Edward's easy smile. And amid this swirl of diplomacy stood the king himself, laughing, negotiating, promising, charming, and occasionally letting his heart wander where protocol frowned. For Edward had a weakness, one that history never let him forget. He fell in love with almost reckless enthusiasm. One could say he collected admirers the way other men collected rare manuscripts. Not that he meant harm, Edward simply lived as though life were a feast, and he was honor-bound to taste every dish. A king, after all, must know his kingdom thoroughly, or so he might argue if caught. Yet, ambition does not rise alone. Behind Edward stood loyal companions and clever minds. Among them, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man with enough political skill to tie a kingdom into a nice little knot. For a time, they danced in harmony, Edward with his charm, Warwick with his shrewdness. Together they steadied England and stitched authority back into the throne's fraying edges. But shadows lengthened even in this newfound brilliance. The Lancastrian cause smoldered in exile. Margaret of Anjou still prowled across foreign courts like a lioness seeking a fresh battlefield. And Warwick, well, power has a way of whispering sweet but dangerous things to those who hold it. The balance between king and kingmaker trembled like a candle flame in a draught. Still, let us linger on Edward as he first takes his crown, young, radiant, and full of promise. Imagine him walking through the great hall, sunlight catching the gold of his circlet, courtiers bowing low as he passes. Outside, the streets buzz with cautious hope. After so many years of turmoil, people longed to believe that this hawk-eyed king would finally lift England into calmer skies. And Edward, for all his flaws, held within him a rare and compelling brilliance. His story would twist, soar, and plunge in the years ahead. But at this moment, this single breath in history, he stood at the summit of destiny, wings outstretched, ready to claim the horizon. Settle yourself gently beneath the quiet of the night and picture England in one of its rare moments of calm, a kingdom still hesitating between fear and hope. In the midst of this fragile stillness, Edward IV, that dazzling hawk king, made a choice that shook the realm more fiercely than any clash of steel. While his council whispered of alliances, foreign brides, and treaties to mend the kingdom's wounds, Edward slipped away from all their clever schemes and followed the call of his own heart. One soft morning, when the dew still clung to the hedges like tiny pearls, he married Elizabeth Woodville in a secret ceremony so small that even the birds seemed unaware of what history had just witnessed. No trumpets, no parade, only a king, a widow of noble but modest birth, and vows spoken in the hush of intimacy. England blinked and then gasped. When news finally reached the court, it arrived like a slap delivered by a silk glove, quiet, elegant, and thoroughly devastating. Noblemen dropped their quills, ladies paused mid-gossip. Even the servants, masters of pretending not to hear anything, exchanged wide-eyed glances. A Woodville? The Elizabeth Woodville? A woman with no royal blood, no foreign kingdom behind her, and, scandal of scandals, already a mother to 2 sons? Oh, the horror! Some courtiers reacted as if Edward had married a wandering minstrel. Others insisted it must be a jest, for surely a king so handsome and clever wouldn't choose love over politics. But he did. And in doing so, he turned the elegant chessboard of English nobility into a table of overturned pieces, with every family scrambling to understand their new place. Elizabeth herself walked into the palace with quiet dignity, her beauty soft and steady like candlelight rather than a blaze. Her calm presence unsettled the court more than she intended. She did not flaunt her crown, yet somehow she wore it as if fate had always meant it for her. And as the nobles stared, some with admiration, many with narrowed eyes, the Woodville family began to drift closer to the heart of power. They were not shy about it. Brothers, sisters, cousins, each one appeared at court with the politeness of guests who insisted they had been invited, even if no one remembered sending them a card. Humorously enough, the old houses of England muttered that the Woodvilles multiplied faster than spring rabbits, and half the court feared waking up to discover they had married one overnight. But beneath the laughter and whispered disapproval lay a deeper storm. Edward's bold, impulsive marriage humiliated the man who had helped build his throne, the Earl of Warwick. The great kingmaker had been negotiating foreign matches, weaving alliances with careful diplomatic threads, and suddenly all his work unraveled with the tug of Edward's heartstrings. The nobles watched Warwick closely, for his silence was far more alarming than any outburst. A man like him did not simply swallow humiliation, he let it settle like a stone in deep waters, waiting for the moment it would drag something under. And so the kingdom stirred uneasily, sensing that the wedding had awakened something more dangerous than wounded pride. But tonight, let us step away from looming conflict and linger on the simple truth at the heart of it all. Edward loved Elizabeth. In a world where crowns were traded like currency and marriages forged like weapons, he chose tenderness over strategy. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it was brave, or perhaps, in a time soaked with ambition and steel, it was the only truly human act left. As moonlight drapes itself across the sleeping fields of England, imagine Edward and Elizabeth standing together, two hearts daring to defy the cold machinery of power. Their union would ripple across the kingdom, stirring allies, enemies, and destinies yet to unfold. Draw closer to the quiet of the evening, and let your breath slow as though the past itself were settling beside you. For just when England thought the storm had spent its fury, a faint tremor stirred beneath the ashes. The red rose of Lancaster, wilted, trampled, and thought long dead, began to lift its head again. Somewhere in the dim corridors of shifting alliances, whispers rose. He is coming back. And who was he? None other than Henry VI, the gentle king with a soul too fragile for a realm carved from iron. His reign had been swept aside by the handsome reign of Edward IV, yet fate, ever fond of mischief, tugged him once more from the shadows. His name drifted across the land like a lost hymn, uncertain yet persistent, as though history itself had forgotten to close a door. Henry's return was not a triumph born from strength, but a resurrection woven from desperation. Lancaster's loyalists, scattered like embers after Towton, began to glow again, fanned by old grievances and quiet fury. It was Queen Margaret, fierce as winter wind, who pressed the world to remember her husband's fragile claim. And then came the unlikeliest of shifts. The Earl of Warwick, the very architect of Edward IV's glory, turned away from the white rose he once raised. A kingmaker scorned becomes a storm in human shape. With pride wounded and ambitions bruised, Warwick reached across the chasm of old enmities and clasped the red standard of Lancaster. Strange bedfellows, some said. A disaster wrapped in velvet, muttered others. But alliances in England had begun to dance in patterns as unpredictable as falling leaves. Through secret routes, dim-lit monasteries, and the quiet hands of sympathizers, Henry VI was lifted from captivity and placed once more into the trembling center of events. Imagine him, thin, pale, eyes distant like a man listening to music no one else can hear, carried through cheering crowds who were not entirely cheering for him, but for the idea of change, of rebalancing the scales. He had the look of a saint, though England needed a soldier, the manner of a monk, though the throne demanded a storm. Some said he smiled gently upon his return, as if unaware of the chaos being woven in his name. Others swore he didn't fully understand why his crown was being restored, only that the world expected it of him. And the world, as it often does, rarely asked whether he wished it. The court itself trembled with uncertainty. Nobles who had once pledged loyalty to York suddenly rediscovered their fondness for red banners. Merchants swapped allegiance with the ease of changing cloaks. Priests whispered prayers that conveniently favored whichever side was nearest. It was as though the kingdom had become a grand masquerade, filled with dancers who never stayed in one place long enough to be unmasked. Henry VI, fragile yet crowned anew, became a symbol of possibility and danger. For a king so gentle could never hold the crown with his own hands. It rested upon him only because warriors, schemers, and wounded lions wished it so. And those same forces could tear it away again with laughing cruelty. Tonight, though, let us hold this moment with delicate fingers. Picture Henry seated quietly in the royal chambers, the crown heavy upon his bowed head. Outside, the banners of Lancaster ripple once more, their red hues returning like embers reignited. Hope mingles with dread in the cold air, for the return of the red rose is not a peaceful bloom. It is a warning that England's heart has begun to beat unevenly again. And as the moon glides across the rooftops of London, you may hear the faint echo of destiny rearranging its steps. Let the night cradle you once more, soft as a lullaby worn smooth by centuries. For England, poor England, had barely caught its breath when destiny decided to spin its wheel again. A realm that had celebrated the return of the red rose now found its joy fading like candle wax in the sun. Henry VI, fragile as a winter branch, sat again upon the throne, but only for a moment, a heartbeat, a sigh in the long hymn of history. Far to the west, the young hawk who once soared above the kingdom stirred with renewed fire. Edward IV, exiled, betrayed, humiliated, refused to yield his story to shadows. And so the wheel creaked, then groaned, and began its merciless turn, one that would lift one man, break another, and drag the whole kingdom along for the ride. Edward's return was not the triumphant march sung in legends, but a quiet, desperate reclamation that grew into thunder. He landed with only a handful of loyal men, so few that if one sneezed, the entire army risked catching cold. Yet Edward had something rarer than soldiers. He had confidence so radiant it bordered on absurd. With each mile he traveled, banners rose. Nobles, weary of Lancaster's uncertainty, flocked back to him as though guided by instinct, as if the kingdom itself remembered how firmly Edward once held the reins. And Edward, smiling with that irresistible mix of charm and danger, welcomed them without complaint. After all, in the grand sport of loyalty, nobles were famous for switching sides faster than a minstrel changes melodies. London opened its gates to him like a long-lost lover, and the city's bells tolled not with fear, but with relief. Henry VI, poor soul, was found in the palace gardens, gentle, confused, whispering prayers to trees that could offer no counsel. It was said he surrendered with the serenity of a man who had never wished for the crown in the first place. And so Edward reclaimed his throne, not with grand ceremony, but with a quiet, inevitable grace, as though the crown recognized him and clicked back into place of its own accord. Thus, the wheel turned again, lifting the white rose back into the sun, while the red rose slipped once more into the shadows. But make no mistake, this shift was no peaceful tide. It roared with battles, betrayals, and the final unraveling of old alliances. Warwick the Kingmaker, once Edward's architect, now stood in opposition, his pride and fury setting the stage for the coming storm. Margaret of Anjou, still fierce, still unyielding, gathered her forces in distant lands, preparing to strike at the heart of the kingdom once more. England was a tapestry pulled too tight, every thread quivering, every knot threatening to tear. And amid it all, Edward walked with renewed authority, holding himself like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it unimpressive. The hawk had returned, not merely to perch, but to command the sky. Settle yourself beneath the hush of midnight and imagine two brothers standing beneath the same ancestral sky. Edward IV, the Hawk King whose confidence could warm a winter field, and George, Duke of Clarence, whose ambition flickered like a restless candle. They were bound by blood, but oh, what stubborn blood it was. Brothers may share a cradle, but not always a destiny, and certainly not a crown. George carried a charm of his own, tall, regal, gifted with a smile that promised loyalty even when his thoughts wandered elsewhere. Yet beneath that elegant exterior lived a tangle of envy and longing, the sort that grows quietly until it breaks through the surface like a thorn from an old, unpruned vine. And so the tale of the unquiet brothers began, not with hatred, but with shadows creeping between their shared memories. Clarence had once marched proudly at Edward's side, his banners fluttering beside York's white rose. But as Edward's star rose higher, brighter, hotter, Clarence found himself squinting against the light. His brother had taken a throne, a queen, a world of admirers. Clarence, meanwhile, felt the familiar sting of being second. Some whispered that he dreamed of his own crown, polished and waiting, as though England kept spare monarchs the way kitchens kept extra loaves of bread. Clarence, of course, denied such thoughts with dramatic indignation, yet his actions often betrayed him. A slight disagreement became a sulk, a political tension became a tantrum, and when Warwick the Kingmaker whispered encouragement in his ear, Clarence listened with the eagerness of a younger sibling told he deserved just a little more attention. Warwick, ever skilled at stirring mischief, played Clarence's pride like a harp. He painted visions of a kingdom where George would reign, admired and adored, while Edward's golden reign faded like a forgotten melody. Clarence, already simmering with jealousy, took the bait. And thus he betrayed Edward, first timidly, then boldly, until he was standing in full rebellion against the very brother who had lifted him so high. But betrayal, once committed, rarely brings the satisfaction one imagines. When Warwick fell and Lancaster's hopes crumbled, Clarence found himself stranded between regret and fear. He slunk back toward Edward's forgiveness, wearing the expression of a child who had stolen a sweet cake and now hoped no one noticed the crumbs on his lips. Edward forgave him, because kings must keep their families close, even when those families sharpen knives in their sleep. Yet Clarence's heart remained a storm of contradictions. He wanted Edward's trust, but resented Edward's strength. He wanted power, but feared the cost. And so trouble followed him like a loyal hound. He stirred quarrels in court, schemed for greater titles, and sulked magnificently whenever life denied him some glittering prize. The Woodville family, now powerful through Queen Elizabeth, became his favorite target. He accused, complained, conspired, and brewed grievances with the dedication of a monk brewing ale. Eventually, Clarence's discontent grew dangerous. Rumors swirled of treason, plots, and dark ambitions whispered behind closed doors. Whether all of it was true mattered less than the simple truth Edward could no longer ignore. His brother's turmoil threatened the kingdom itself. Love can mend much, but even a king's patience has mortal limits. And so Clarence met a fate whispered through the centuries, strange, tragic, and soaked in melancholy. Legend claims he was executed in the Tower, drowned in a butt of Malmsey, as though tragedy itself couldn't resist a touch of bitter humor. A brother undone by ambition, a king wounded by the necessity of justice. Tonight, let us not dwell on the cruelty of it, but on the fragile bond that once held them together. Two boys grew to men, standing on different sides of the same destiny. Edward survived, but a shadow lingered in his reign, reminding him that power, for all its brilliance, demands painful sacrifices. Lean closer to the quiet, for tonight we step into a softer, darker corner of this royal tapestry, where a boy once walked with a crooked gait and an iron will. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest brother of Edward IV and Clarence, grew not from sunlight, but from shadow. While Edward shone like gold and Clarence glimmered like silver, Richard carried the sheen of steel, cold, understated, enduring. His childhood was carved by hardship, exile, danger, and the bitter taste of loss. He learned early that the world spares no tenderness for the frail, and so he forged his own armor, not from metal, but from discipline, silence, and observation. Even as a child, he looked at the world the way a raven studies a battlefield, quietly, sharply, without blinking. Where Clarence complained, Richard endured. Where Edward charmed, Richard calculated. And while courtly whispers mocked his thin frame and uneven shoulders, they often forgot he possessed a mind sharper than half the kingdom's swords. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing secrets like parchment drinking ink. Men underestimated him. Oh, what a favorite pastime that was in the royal court. Perhaps they mistook his calm for frailty, or his loyalty for softness. But Richard's loyalty was a thing forged in fire, absolute, unflinching, almost frightening in its purity. To Edward, he became a shadow that guarded rather than darkened. If Edward was the hawk soaring above the realm, Richard was the watchful figure at the edge of the forest, unseen but always aware. Richard's adolescence unfolded amid the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. While other boys learned to dance or woo ladies with poems, he learned the language of battlefields, the weight of armor, the rhythm of hooves, the art of surviving men twice his size. He rode with Edward through storms of steel, proving himself not by bravado, but by bone-deep resolve. Soldiers whispered that he seemed carved for war, as though the din of conflict steadied his heartbeat instead of frightening it. Yet even in the clash of armies, Richard remained strangely thoughtful, a young man who might pause amid the smoke and wonder how fate decided who lived and who vanished into the mud. Some called that depth, others called it darkness. At court, Richard moved like a figure inked into the margins, present, indispensable, yet rarely at the center of the page. Edward trusted him more than anyone. He granted Richard lands, authority, and responsibilities that would have crushed lesser nobles. And Richard bore them without complaint, without swagger, without the exhausting theatrics Clarence so loved. But his sharp mind and rising influence did not go unnoticed. The Woodvilles eyed him warily. Other nobles whispered of the king's quiet brother, the one who never raised his voice, yet seemed to understand every plot before it began. It is a peculiar truth of history that the quietest men attract the loudest rumors, and Richard, calm, unreadable, relentlessly dutiful, became a canvas for the fears and imaginations of those around him. Tonight, though, let us see him not as legend, neither the monster some claimed he was, nor the saint others defended, but as a man shaped by shadows, yet loyal to the light he chose to follow. Picture him standing at the castle ramparts long after the torches burned low, watching the moon settle over the kingdom his brother ruled. Ambition did not yet burn in him, only duty, sharpened by sorrow and tempered by intellect. He was a figure waiting for his hour, not hungrily, but inevitably, as though destiny had already marked his place. They say even the brightest hawk must one day fold its wings, and so it was with Edward IV, the great Lord of York, who once strode across England like a golden storm, now lay weakened by years of excess, battles, and the weight of a crown that had never truly rested lightly. His chambers, once filled with laughter, velvet whispers, and the rustle of courtly intrigue, fell into a hush so deep it felt as if the whole kingdom were holding its breath. Even the tapestries on the walls, those proud woven chronicles of Yorkist triumph, seemed to dim their colors in anticipation. Courtiers gathered like ghosts at the threshold of his room, peering in with the timidity of mice who had grown accustomed to a lion's shadow. Physicians muttered remedies that sounded more desperate than hopeful, and priests whispered prayers so softly they barely stirred the candles. Edward, once a figure who made nations tremble merely by mounting his horse, now drifted in and out of fevered dreams, calling faintly for battles long won and brothers long lost. The crown slipped from him not with a scream, but with a sigh, quiet, tired, inevitable. When news of his death rippled across England, it moved like a cold wind at the height of spring, unexpected, unwelcome, and powerful enough to bend branches. In taverns, men raised their mugs more out of habit than celebration, as if unsure whether to mourn a king or brace for the storm his departure promised. Old women muttered omens, youths exchanged uneasy glances, and even the merchants, who usually cared more for wool prices than funerals, walked with a hesitance that suggested they sensed history shifting beneath their feet. A kingdom built on Edward's broad shoulders suddenly felt frighteningly hollow. And then, of course, there were the princes, two boys with eyes too bright and crowns too heavy. Edward I, the elder, earnest and clever, still more comfortable with tutors than courtiers. Richard, the younger, lively as a sparrow and just as unaware of the hawks circling overhead. They stood beside their father's bier with trembling lips and hopeful hearts, not yet understanding that grief is not the only beast that stalks a royal orphan. For though England bowed its head in mourning, many whispered that a child king was a candle in the wind, and ambitious men were already cupping their hands toward the flame. The council scrambled like startled hens, clucking over regencies, guardianships, titles and alliances. No one wanted to offend the dead king's memory, yet everyone wanted to control the living heirs. Wooden tables groaned under the weight of scrolls and seals, while quills scratched anxiously through the night. In every corner of the realm, nobles polished their armor, not out of piety, but anticipation. After all, in England, a vacant throne had a way of inviting trouble like bread invites mice. The kingdom prayed for peace, but its heartbeat said otherwise. And as the sun set on the day Edward IV was laid to rest, a long shadow stretched across the land, a shadow with sharp edges and a silent tread. For somewhere in the halls of power, a man who knew patience as well as he knew ambition watched the chaos unfold with hooded eyes. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the loyal brother, the quiet guardian, the figure who rarely spoke unless truth or duty compelled him, now found himself standing at the brink of a destiny whispered about in prophecy and feared in rumor. Edward IV was gone. The throne stood trembling, and fate, sly as ever, prepared to flip England's coin once more. Night has a way of softening even the harshest stones, and so the old Tower of London often seemed almost gentle at dusk, its gray walls blushing beneath the dying sun, its battlements humming faintly with the day's last birds. Yet beneath that serene facade lived a silence that history still strains to understand. For within those walls, two young princes once slept, dreamed, and whispered hopes far too delicate for the world they were born into. Edward and Richard, brothers bound by blood, by fear, and by a crown that neither could yet comprehend, arrived at the Tower not as prisoners, but as heirs preparing for coronation. At least, that was the tale the kingdom was meant to believe. They played in courtyards where the stones had known centuries of footsteps. They studied beneath windows that caught the river's glow. At night, they spoke to each other in the soft, hurried murmurs shared only by children who sensed that the adults around them were hiding truths too heavy for small shoulders. Their keepers came and went, faces kind one day, unreadable the next. The great doors of the tower closed a little earlier. Footsteps in the hall grew more carefully measured. The air itself seemed to tighten like a harp string pulled too far. Yet the boys, innocent, hopeful, found ways to laugh. A wooden knight carved by the younger prince, a game of chase echoing lightly through the corridors, 2 small lanterns glowing by their bedside, flickering like twin stars trying to hold back the dusk. And then, one night, the lanterns went out, one after the other, quietly, without alarm. The tower kept its secrets with the loyalty of stone. No cries were heard, no records left with trembling ink, just a gradual fading, first in the eyes of those who tended them, then in the whispers of the court, until even the ravens seemed to croak more softly when circling the battlements. London woke one morning with a peculiar hush, as though the city itself sensed something precious had slipped from its grasp. Rumors curled through the kingdom like mist over the Thames. Some claimed the princes had been spirited away to safety. Others believed they had simply vanished into the deep folds of royal intrigue, like 2 pages torn gently from a book. Few dared to speak of darker possibilities, for even the stones of the tower seemed to frown at such talk. And so the truth settled into shadows, neither confessed nor denied, neither confirmed nor forgotten. What remained was a story half-whispered, the kind that old grandmothers mention only when the fire burns low and children lean close. A tale of 2 boys whose laughter once touched those ancient walls, whose footsteps faded too soon, and whose fate hangs suspended like a question left deliberately unanswered. On certain nights, when the moon drifts pale above the river, and the wind brushes against the tower with a sigh, some say they hear the faint echo of youthful voices, soft, playful, unafraid, as if the princes, wherever they wandered, left behind a trace of their dreams. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, innocence lingers, like 2 small lights that refuse to die. Let the night cradle you once more, soft as a lullaby worn smooth by centuries. For England, poor England, had barely caught its breath when destiny decided to spin its wheel again. A realm that had celebrated the return of the red rose now found its joy fading like candle wax in the sun. Henry VI, fragile as a winter branch, sat again upon the throne, but only for a moment, a heartbeat, a sigh in the long hymn of history. Far to the west, the young hawk who once soared above the kingdom stirred with renewed fire. Edward IV, exiled, betrayed, humiliated, refused to yield his story to shadows. And so the wheel creaked, then groaned, and began its merciless turn, one that would lift one man, break another, and drag the whole kingdom along for the ride. Edward's return was not the triumphant march sung in legends, but a quiet, desperate reclamation that grew into thunder. He landed with only a handful of loyal men, so few that if one sneezed, the entire army risked catching cold. Yet Edward had something rarer than soldiers. He had confidence so radiant it bordered on absurd. With each mile he traveled, banners rose. Nobles, weary of Lancaster's uncertainty, flocked back to him as though guided by instinct, as if the kingdom itself remembered how firmly Edward once held the reins. And Edward, smiling with that irresistible mix of charm and danger, welcomed them without complaint. After all, in the grand sport of loyalty, nobles were famous for switching sides faster than a minstrel changes melodies. London opened its gates to him like a long-lost lover, and the city's bells tolled not with fear, but with relief. Henry VI, poor soul, was found in the palace gardens, gentle, confused, whispering prayers to trees that could offer no counsel. It was said he surrendered with the serenity of a man who had never wished for the crown in the first place. And so Edward reclaimed his throne, not with grand ceremony, but with a quiet, inevitable grace, as though the crown recognized him and clicked back into place of its own accord. Thus, the wheel turned again, lifting the white rose back into the sun, while the red rose slipped once more into the shadows. But make no mistake, this shift was no peaceful tide. It roared with battles, betrayals, and the final unraveling of old alliances. Warwick the Kingmaker, once Edward's architect, now stood in opposition, his pride and fury setting the stage for the coming storm. Margaret of Anjou, still fierce, still unyielding, gathered her forces in distant lands, preparing to strike at the heart of the kingdom once more. England was a tapestry pulled too tight, every thread quivering, every knot threatening to tear. And amid it all, Edward walked with renewed authority, holding himself like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it unimpressive. The hawk had returned, not merely to perch, but to command the sky.
There are nights when history itself seems to shiver, as though remembering a moment too heavy for its old bones. And if you listen closely, perhaps on a quiet evening when the wind crawls low across the grass, you may hear it sigh the name of a battlefield, Bosworth. It was there, beneath a sky the color of tarnished steel, that the last white rose of York began to bend, trembling on its stem as fate reached for it with cold, deliberate fingers. The dawn broke reluctantly, as if the sun hesitated to illuminate what it knew would soon unfold. Richard III rode at the head of his host, armor polished like a dark mirror, his banner stitched with a white boar snapping proudly in the morning wind. He looked every inch a king, unyielding, sharp-eyed, a warrior born from scars and defiance. Yet some said they saw a shadow cling to him, subtle but persistent, as though the day itself whispered warnings he refused to hear. Across the field, Henry Tudor's forces gathered, an untested claimant wrapped in French gold and borrowed hope. His banner bore the red dragon, an old symbol dreaming of new destiny. His army was smaller, less seasoned, but behind him stood noblemen who had grown weary of Yorkist thorns, and among the hedges perched the cunning eyes of Lord Stanley, who watched like a cat waiting for both mice to tire. The land between them was soft, treacherous, marsh and meadow woven together in a quiet conspiracy. Yet Richard pressed forward, the thunder of hooves rising like a heartbeat about to falter. Steel clashed with steel. Men cried out in that immortal mixture of terror and resolve, and England's soil, so long familiar with blood, felt the old warmth seep into its roots again. Richard fought as if he were carved from the very will of his ancestors. He cut a path through enemy lines with a ferocity that startled even those who once feared him. At one point, he stood so close to Henry Tudor that witnesses swore they saw the two destinies meet eye to eye, like twin blades hovering before the strike. "Treason! Treason!" Richard shouted, not in fear but in outrage, as Stanley's forces finally chose their side, and chose it loudly. It was then that the tide broke. Like a great tapestry unraveling thread by thread, the white rose withered before it even touched the ground. Richard's horse fell. The king rose again. Surrounded, battered, he refused to flee. He fought on foot, crown dented, breath ragged, the earth beneath him turning to mire. Some say he laughed, bitterly, bravely, when the circle of enemies closed, a king defending his throne to his last living heartbeat. And so Richard III, the last Yorkist king, fell. Not crawling, not pleading, but upright, sword in hand, his courage burning hotter than the hatred that chased him through history's corridors. The crown was taken from a branch bush nearby, tangled in thorns, as if nature itself mocked the throne, and placed upon Henry Tudor's head. With that simple, brutal gesture, the white rose's petals drifted to the ground, fading gently into silence. England shifted. The air changed. Somewhere far from the battlefield, an old power stood a little quieter than before, as though one final chapter of its sorrow had been sealed, and thus ended the long, weary bloom of York, not with a triumphant flourish, but with the soft, melancholy sigh of a flower that had held on for as long as it could, until destiny asked it to let go. Morning sometimes arrives like a shy guest, lingering at the threshold before daring to enter. And so it was with the dawn that greeted England after Bosworth, a pale, trembling light, unsure whether the kingdom was ready to begin again. The winds carried the echoes of battle still, yet beneath them stirred something gentler, almost hesitant, the first breath of a new age, carried on the shoulders of a man who had spent most of his life running from the very crown now offered to him. Henry Tudor, quiet, cautious, built more from endurance than spectacle, stood upon soil still wet with yesterday's sorrow. He was no warrior king carved from legend, no boisterous prince raised among roaring feasts. Instead, he was the survivor of too many nights spent in exile, listening to foreign seas whisper doubts at his window. Perhaps that was why the crown suited him oddly well. He wore it not with arrogance, but with a sigh, as if fully aware that thrones are never truly gifts, only burdens wrapped in silk. His claim was fragile, thin as parchment, his bloodline stitched together by distant threads. Yet England, exhausted, bruised, longing for quiet, saw him not as an intruder, but as the possibility of peace. A red rose risen from long-buried roots, cautious yet determined, ready to try again. Still, even a dawn needs warmth to drive away the lingering cold, and that warmth came in the form of a woman whose very presence felt like a bridge between two broken worlds, Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Her lineage carried the white rose, noble, luminous, stained by the grief of too many vanished heirs. She bore the dignity of a kingdom that had lost much, yet still hoped. Their marriage was not the stuff of romantic poems, at least not at first. It was a decision made with trembling fingertips and weary hearts, a union shaped not by passion, but by necessity. But when Henry placed his hand gently over Elizabeth's, England felt something shift. The red and white roses, long torn apart by ambition and vengeance, were finally woven together into a single emblem, the Tudor rose. Soft petals interlaced, past wounds folded into new harmony. The kingdom exhaled. For the first time in decades, banners no longer screamed for opposing houses. Children grew up learning one symbol instead of two. The whispers of revolt dimmed, though not entirely. Peace, after all, does not arrive like lightning. It grows like a small seed tucked into winter earth, slow, uncertain, miraculous. Henry governed with measured steps, trimming the edges of rebellion, encouraging trade, restoring the order so desperately needed. And Elizabeth stood beside him, a quiet queen whose grace softened the heavy corners of his reign. Some nights, the court musicians would play as courtiers moved like drifting ghosts across the hall. Henry would watch Elizabeth from a distance, and perhaps in those tender moments he saw not just a queen, but the living proof that even the deepest wounds can be coaxed toward healing. Two families, once bound by hate, now sat at the same table. Two histories, stained with too many tears, learned to share the same breath. And outside the palace walls, the people, farmers, cobblers, widows, wandering minstrels, slowly discovered what it felt like to live without choosing a color of allegiance. The kingdom began to mend. The nights, once restless with fear, grew quiet enough for lullabies again. Thus, from the ashes of old sorrow, a new dawn crept over England. Not radiant at first, just a soft glow, gentle and cautious. But it was enough. Enough to guide a weary nation into the embrace of morning, where red and white finally bloomed side by side, at peace in the same light.
Night often holds its breath before a story ends, as though reluctant to release the final note. And so England, after generations crushed beneath the weight of roses, red and white, exhaled at last. The wars that once rattled the bones of the kingdom faded into soft echoes, leaving behind a land yearning for stillness. From this quiet, the Tudor dynasty rose, not like a roar of triumph, but like a lantern lit gently in a long, darkened room. Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York stood as living symbols of a truce stitched from sorrow. Their union did not magically erase the past, nor did it mend every wound, but it offered something rarer than victory: balance. A place where the embers of hatred could cool, where the soil once soaked in blood could remember the sweetness of spring. The Tudor rose, half red and half white, unfurled across banners and seal alike, reminding all who saw it that peace is seldom born from strength alone. Sometimes it grows from two broken halves choosing to stand together. The kingdom slowly awakened to gentler days. Markets bustled again, not with rumors of rebellion, but with laughter and trade. Children who had never seen a battlefield learned lullabies instead of war songs. The old scars of the land softened beneath new harvests, and the people, weathered, resilient, began to trust in mornings once more. Yet history, with its patient heartbeat, never truly departs. It lingers in the stones of old castles, in the hush of forgotten corridors, in the quiet tenderness of names etched into memory. The Wars of the Roses slipped into the realm of tales, but their lessons, fragile, precious, remained. They whispered that ambition without mercy leads only to ash, that crowns weigh heavier than they shine, that even the fiercest houses can find peace when they finally allow themselves to lay their swords down. Perhaps, as you rest tonight, you'll feel those echoes, a distant flutter of crimson and white settling softly like petals across your thoughts. Their story is not a warning, nor a lament, but a reminder. The past never vanishes. It simply sleeps, waiting for someone kind enough to wake it with care. And now, dear listener, as our long journey through shadows and kingdoms draws to a close, let the quiet wrap around you like a gentle cloak. May the dreams that find you be soft, may the night treat you kindly, and may the tales of old England drift with you into slumber like a warm breeze brushing ancient pages. If your heart still hungers for more forgotten echoes, for kingdoms long faded and souls who once shaped the world, then follow the whisper back to Let Me Tell You. There, under the hush of another evening, another story waits, patient, timeless, ready to breathe again.